What we're seeing right now on the right, on one end, there's a form of nihilism occurring in response to what has happened to the institutions. And sometimes they refer to themselves, and some of them are friends of mine, as the dissident right. I've even had some of these people on my show. I think their observations about what is wrong are largely correct. What I don't really know ever is what they want instead. I can't ever figure that out. That's why I keep trying to tune in to find out, and I don't really know. And then ultimately, what I also don't know is if once I even find out what they want, is this even achievable east of Eden in recognition of who we are as a species? And a lot of this, frankly, is coming out of a Reformed theology camp. Much of that theology, by the way, I am somewhat at least friendly to. But just as we've talked a lot about, should dispensational eschatology play a role in American foreign policy or not? And I'm fine pushing back on that if I don't agree. But if we're at the point now that some of this Reformed dissident theology is actually Hitler, count me out. That's my tap out. I'm out right there. Actually, Churchill's the bad guy. I'm out. I'm out on that. I mean, I'm not going to change my theology for you. I'm still going to do my best at what I think to glean and exegetically, hermeneutically, as soundly as I can in my own fallen, sinful state. Follow the scriptures. But I'm not in that group. I'm not here. I agree that Winston Churchill was a complicated figure. You're talking about a man that had been prime minister in the 1920s of one party and prime minister in the 1940s of another. He'd been exiled on and off. But you know who's not a complicated figure? Hitler. Not a complicated figure. Sat in a prison cell in 1925 writing his own manifesto of global conquest. And little did he know, it wasn't going to be until a decade later, after he orchestrated the Reichstag fire, the takeover of the entire German government. He was just going to be content with all of that after rethinking it over until provoked unfairly by Winston Churchill. Wrong. And what happens when people go with these kinds of alternative theories, there's no way to disprove them. And that's the point. It's a form of Gnosticism. They're special, don't you know? They're smarter than us. They figured it out, and the rest of us just can't. I'll say this again. God wants truth to be known. God wants truth to be obvious. He can't make it any obvious that he put things in a book and gave it to humanity for free. God doesn't have complicated formulas. There's not alternative views in history. The alternative views in history crowd, that's the enemy's thinking. They think like that. They start from the wrong premise. We start with the most obvious truths of the universe. And when we have maybe the most important platforms on our side entertaining this stuff, it is poisonous, including when it comes from people that I personally like and respect.
So right after hearing that, part of me wants to say, quiet, the adults are talking, come on. And it's funny. So there's this person that listens to my podcast, comments, and every time I read the comments, I say to myself, do you even listen to my show? Like, did you even listen to what I said? And so I'm at the point where I don't even reply to that person's comments or acknowledge them. And it was actually my first thought here. Was Steve didn't listen to this whole interview. He heard some of it and then jumped right in mouth first. So I will say, and I want to say this first because I want there to be clarity, that I really think that this stuff about disavowal and endorsement and the idea of platforming people is pretty stupid. A lot of it is moral preaching and posturing and performative and just childish. So you won't hear me on here saying, oh, I disavowed this and crocodile tears coming from my eyes and stuff like that. And this does not mean I don't endorse, I will take the person to task on their ideas. And again, I want to do it in a charitable way. But I will say regarding this topic I'm talking about, evil exists. and I will call it out as I see it, as the Bible tells me. So I will say on this, I am not, nor will I ever be, a National Socialist. Not going to happen. I will also emphasize to you guys that, yeah, war crimes were committed in World War II. That is documented. That is true. And I'm going to say more at some other point. I want to make another episode or maybe a series about the Second World War. But I'll say now that I reject the first three political theories: liberalism, Marxism, and National Socialism. I reject 20th century ideologies. I'm a reactionary. I'm a traditionalist. Because, and it's funny about that, because when I just said that, I'm talking about, the first theory being liberalism, the second Marxism, and the third National Socialism. That's something that Alexander Dugin says. I'm not a Duginite. But when I say that I reject 20th century ideologies, it's because they all get something wrong, very important. Now, notice how Steve Deace tries to sweep this under the rug and says, oh, well, Churchill was complicated. And you just want to look at the guy and say, you think? Listen to the Daryl Cooper and Tucker Carlson interview. Britain looks defeated and Japan had 2 nukes dropped on them and looks better in many ways. And then the question has to be raised, and people have to ask, what did that? What led to that country being in that position? And if you can't even ask these questions, you're never going to get a satisfactory answer. And that's really what we're seeing on the right. He calls it nihilism. No, it's people saying these answers aren't really good enough. We need to have better answers about these questions. So what happened? What caused? This is to answer the question. What happened to Britain? What happened to America? Liberal democracy. Progressivism that called itself conservatism and was actually progressivism and liberalism driving the speed limit. But then they call themselves conservative so that people would think they were conservative. I want to further say here that what Daryl Cooper did on this podcast on the Tucker Carlson Network, and again, I'm going to urge you to watch it for yourself, was not Jew hatred and was not Hitler apologism. You guys need to listen to it for yourself. Hitler apologism and criticizing Churchill are not the same thing. And on this, Steve Deace is kind of conflating two ideas. Daryl Cooper is asking questions about how come this ideology prevailed, but it actually has left the West looking a lot worse. And this is something I meant to say earlier, but I didn't exactly say. One of the most interesting parts of the podcast on the Tucker Carlson Network was when Daryl Cooper said we were running an experiment at the time that we didn't know we were running. The experiment we were running was liberalism, liberal democracy in the West, and then behind the Iron Curtain, none of that was there. And that's really true, because what's funny is, think about it. Yeah, it was horrible in the Soviet Union for a very long time, but liberalism didn't make its way into there. And look at those countries now. Look at them in terms of, where are the pride parades? Where are the drag queen story hour times? Where are the transgender surgeries? And how come it seems to be a culturally homogenous country out towards that part of the world, Eastern Europe? You have to be able to ask these questions, and unfortunately, Steve Deace doesn't think you should be able to. It should be fall in line, obey, and listen to and accept what your history teacher taught you, and don't question it. And Aaron McIntyre, not to be confused with Orrin McIntyre. Orrin McIntyre is really based. Aaron's works for The Blaze. Tells you what you need to know. Tried to say, well, these questions need to be asked, this needs to be discussed. But that was not Steve's attitude at all. It was, how could he, how dare he, this is evil. And it's funny because he mentions dispensationalism. You have to ask yourself, how much of that, his theological beliefs about the end times, because it sounds like he's a dispensationalist. He says he's friendly to Reformed theology, and he said he's fine with the question about dispensational theology having to do with influencing our foreign policy as a country. He says he's willing to push back against that. Makes me think he sounds like he's a dispensationalist. How much of that is why he attacked Candace Owens with the vigor that he did, and is attacking Tucker Carlson and Daryl Cooper with the vigor that he is. I think it's worth looking at, because Tucker Carlson and Daryl Cooper have to be able to have this conversation for us to have an open dialogue, and for us, the listeners, to be able to even ask questions and get them answered. What I'm going to say about this idea of, oh, well, just by criticizing Churchill, he's somehow saying Hitler's okay. False. That's not what Daryl Cooper said, not what Tucker said. In fact, if you think that Daryl Cooper is a white nationalist or a white supremacist, he's a pretty bad one, because of the fact that at one point he mentioned the KKK and said that they deserve to be arrested. So he's not some white supremacist or white nationalist type, far from it. And the way I would look at this situation with World War II is sort of like an abusive dad and an alcoholic mom. An alcoholic mom who will not leave the man and take the kids, could, but won't. And as soon as 2:30 in the afternoon hits, she's drunk. She's drunk when the kids come home from school. The dad gets home. He leaves her alone, but he beats the crap out of his kids. And what Steve Deace is attempting to do is say, well, there's nothing complicated about Hitler. I tend to agree with that. I do agree with that. I explicitly agree with that. But Joseph Stalin is not a complicated guy either. And why did Winston Churchill side with Joseph Stalin? And that doesn't make me a bad person for asking that question. And Steve Deace would have you believe that it does.